Okay. So for our next panel, we are going to take a look at the genuine dangers that lie across the horizon in the moment that we're in. I'll remind everybody, I can't control what anyone says, but I'll remind everyone that it is a nonpartisan event with C3 and C4 sponsoring organizations. Please do your best with that. And the comments that any individuals make, Joanna and the others were teasing me because they knew I would say this, but the comments that individuals make do not reflect the views of NYU or the sponsoring organizations. Notwithstanding that, the three panelists that I will now introduce for our tour of the threats will speak their mind very vigorously. My colleagues Bob Kagan, brilliant columnist, historian, and scholar Jen Rubin, whose reported opinion columns for the Post are must-reading, and Dahlia Lithwick, whose work on rule of law, courts, and judges has never been more essential than it is now. So, Bob, the Trump campaign was at a crossroads. We were supposed to hear about unity, collegiality, a new face, and instead we got J.D. Vance. I know you have thoughts about Vance, but I think it's very important because it tells us something about his transformation, and his views tell us something about the moment we're in and what the trajectory is, the choice that is being made by the Republican Party. For those who don't know, Bob was the foreign policy advisor for John McCain. So I'm looking to Bob for some insight on J.D. Vance, for starters.
Well, I don't know if I could really give too much info on J.D. Vance other than what he says. Well, first of all, let me just say it's wonderful to be here. Norm, thank you, and the other co-sponsors for putting this together. When we first talked about coming on this panel, I did not expect much laughter that we've been having all day today, and I expected a somewhat more somber mood, but clearly there's something has changed, and the laughter level is high. So
that's a good sign for democracy.
That's a good sign, exactly. That is a great sign for democracy. I was going to talk about foreign policy, but since you gave me this opportunity to talk about Vance, I just wanted to get into one area and really back up something that previous panelists have said, which is that what we're facing today is not a new phenomenon in America. In fact, it's an old phenomenon. It's the oldest phenomenon. It is people who fundamentally reject the basic principles on which this country was founded. And that has been true from the beginning, obviously, with slaveholders and then in Jim Crow South, but also on religious grounds. There have been many Americans who've really fundamentally objected to the founders' real, intentional separation of church and state. But I have a question, actually, which is, if Donald Trump and J.D. Vance came out and said, we stand for white nationalism and white Christian nationalism, would that be a problem for them? I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that is what they said. Absolutely. And I think it's really important. You know, J.D. Vance, who hangs around with a lot of intellectuals, or at least reads a lot of intellectuals, you know, said something in his acceptance speech, which I think 99% of Americans had no idea what he was talking about, when he said that America is not a creedal nation. I don't think most people give any thought to what creedal means or anything, but let me tell you what he was saying. There is only one creed in America, and that's the creed that derives from the Declaration of Independence and its principles, and it is about universal equality, and it is about protection of individual rights against government and community and whatever else wants to deny people their individual rights. That is the creed that J.D. Vance says we should not be following. And I think it's important to understand that, because this is not a Republican-Democratic issue. And I have to say, it is not an issue about economics. As tempted as people are to be sort of curious about J.D. Vance's claims to be a populist. What this election is the driving force behind the Trump movement is an ethno-religious definition of America, which is to say, this is a white Christian country. And that is what they are running on. When Donald Trump introduced himself to Americans as a politician, he introduced himself with one issue, and that issue was birtherism. So his issue that he made his issue, and he rose to the top of the Republican polls in 2011, talking about the fact that America's first black president was not really an American. And when he did that, he signaled to everyone out there who shares that basic prejudice that he was their guy. And this year, that is the campaign he's running. He's running on poison the blood. Whose blood? What he's talking about, and what J.D. Vance said explicitly, if anybody bothered to understand what he was saying, is that this is a nation founded by white Christians, for white Christians. Other people can live here, but they are not, as Hulk Hogan, the great philosopher, said, they are not real Americans. And I think it's really important to understand that. I find it really amazing the degree to which, for instance, the New York Times wants to play with this idea that maybe they're kind of really interested in the poor people and the working class. And so let's hear what they have to say about that. That is not what this election is about. And I just don't know whether, I don't know how many votes Trump would lose if they just said explicitly, we are for white Christian nationalism. I mean, in a way, I don't want to know the answer to that question, but I think it is important that we remember that that's what this election is ultimately about. They are running against the founders, okay? They are running against the founding principles of this nation, and I think we need to spend the next 3 months clarifying that for a lot of Americans. I don't know how many Republicans, I see Norm Orsi in the audience, I don't know how many Republicans he loses if they understand clearly that that's what this is about. And maybe it's not enough, but I would like to think it is enough, and that at the margins, that is going to be a big issue. So don't let Vance get out there and talk about we shouldn't be a creedal America without spelling out for everybody exactly what he means by that.
Jen Rubin. I think we can agree. When I first met Jen, when she started as a columnist at the Post, it was to be a conservative voice and a Republican voice in an opinion landscape that was dominated by more liberal actors. And I have to say, because I'm the event organizer, I got to pick the panel I wanted to moderate. My 3 friends here have been some of the earliest, bluntest, and most accurate in foreseeing what the challenge that we're faced with. Jen, how do you define this moment, this challenge of rebuilding the center and the Project 2025 plans that put some flesh on the bones of Bob's point about white Christian national ideology being at stake at the ballot box?
Well, thank you again for having me. Norm and I would like to say, have met on the political spectrum, but I think I've gone to his left.
You have. She's sped past me.
I'm now an open borders communist. So there you have it. Just before I answer Norm's question, to follow up on what Bob said, I have a book for you, and it's called Midnight in America by Adam Hochschild. And it is about the period 1917 to 1921. And it is a beautiful treatise, fairly long book, that there is nothing new under the sun. Violation of civil liberties, virulent anti-labor movement, violence, virulent racism, xenophobia, fear of the left. It was all there. You could be reading about 2017, or you could be reading about 2026, depending upon what we all decide to do. So yes, this is not new. And when people say that's not America, I have news for them. It's part of America. So where does that leave us? And by the way, I will do a shameless plug. I don't know if A.G. Ellison is still here, but today in the Washington Post, you will find a piece by myself on The Center Must Hold. It is based upon an adaptation of a book that I was delighted to contribute to, along with people like Tony Blair, Malcolm Turnbull, and others. So the point about centrism is well taken. Okay, so 2025, where are we and what does it really mean? I think you have to look at that as really three things. Now, they divide it into four different areas of government, but I like to think of it this way. First, it is a recipe for creating an authoritarian, unitary executive. You replace 50,000 civil servants with people who swear an oath to Trump. Think about that for a minute. They're not swearing an oath to the Constitution, they're swearing an oath to him. Secondly, you're going to have a personalized Justice Department and FBI somehow rearranged and put at the president's disposal. Third, you're going to have the military be used, as many of the other speakers said, to suppress domestic dissent. This is the centralization of executive power that you see, whether it's Mussolini, whether it's Viktor Orban, whoever it is. It's to centralize power, authority in one person in the centralized state. Second thing this does is it systematically destroys the things that government does that are good for people. And I don't mean that in an ideological way. A big section of this talks about doing away with the Federal Reserve or having the executive decide the proper range for the Federal Reserve. It's about taking away the dual mandate, which is both inflation and unemployment. This is the fundamental basis for a sound economy. If you can imagine the economic harm and damage that would do not only here, but internationally, it's tremendous. So a basic function of government to keep the economy on an even keel, they want to destroy. They want to lop off whole areas of government, whether it's the education department, whether it's the, get this, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. What? Because they don't want to hear about hurricanes, I guess? I don't know. They are basically trimming back, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's Head Start, the things that government does for the general people, the general good. So, two very bad things, and I think who is ever trying to explain this would do well to make sure people understand what this means to you. Are you a working class mother? Are you a senior? Are you a student? Because there is not a single person in America who would not be financially and otherwise devastated. But the part that disturbs me the most, and I had kind of heard about it, and then I actually had to read the thing because Norm asked me to, is the entire section on the Christianization of government. It makes it explicit that the government is going to promulgate and proselytize a certain brand of Christian fundamentalism. It's going to redefine the family. It's going to excise, get this, I'm not making this up, from regulations and laws, words like gender or abortion. Does that mean these things don't exist because we're not allowed to speak of them? This is truly Orwellian, that if we take the word away, then we take the reality away. It is an effort to, as Bob alluded to make sure that people understand who's on top and who isn't. It is not only about white, it's not only about Christian, but it's also about male domination. The description of the family they give is one in which the husband/father dominates. This is an ethic and an outlook of a small segment of Christianity that they want to now use the instruments of the state to impose on all the rest of us. Freedom of religion? No. Freedom of conscience? No. Separation of church and state? No. So unless you are in that slight sliver and you have that view, it's not just abortion, it's not just LGBTQ rights, it's every aspect of government. You are not part of the club unless you reach and maintain your identity in that narrow stratum. And that is the most un-American thing I have ever seen. And the fact that they would put it in writing is absolutely petrifying to me.
All right, I'm gonna come back to you to discuss what we can do about it. But Dahlia, will you reflect on this moment a little bit through the lens of what's going on in the courts, the enabling that has occurred in this term at the Supreme Court, the astonishment of Judge Cannon issuing her opinion, lawless opinion, throwing out that case on the morning of the RNC. It was like a nomination speech for Donald Trump, not a judicial opinion. Maybe it was a self-nomination for her judicial advancement. And how do judicial developments interact with the threat that Bob and our brilliant Jan Rubin have articulated?
So I want to actually say I'm gobsmacked that you all are still here. I thought by this part it was going to be like us and Norm Ornstein, and that's it. Like, it's totally unbelievable and incredibly meaningful that you are putting the day toward this.
Give yourselves a hand.
And the other thing, I guess I just want to note, we did our pre-panel conference call from the depths of despair before what happened this weekend happened, and we could barely lift our heads off our desks to talk to one another. I wanted to bring like a hip flask of bourbon because I thought it was going to be so depressing. But I also just want to warn any of you who have raised toddlers knows that we're in the sugar shock moment right now where we are so happy and excited and in love, and after sugar shock, right, as soon as we get the VP nomination, you know what happens, and it's rolling around in the aisles wanting candy and screaming. Like, this is a great moment and we should use it to energize ourselves, but also there's going to be a lot of whining. This is a good feeling. Let's use it and deploy it and understand it's going to be a slog the next couple of weeks. So to Norm's question, I think I want to start by saying that after the immunity decision came down on the last day of the term, and I have to say I've been covering the Supreme Court for 25 years, I did not think I was capable of being shocked, and it shocked me. And it shocked me having heard oral arguments, the breadth of what the court did and the havoc it wrought, and the ways in which the Chief Justice, John Roberts, that I have been covering for a very long time, just left the building, and in fact didn't just leave the building, but was the architect of this opinion, was staggering to me. And at the time I thought, and I want to say this very clearly, when we as lawyers have the deep temptation in a moment like that to start lawyering that opinion, right? So I'm going to figure out what's an official act and an unofficial act and what kind of evidence I can import from one to the other and what's outer perimeter and what's court. Like, that's the lawyerly impulse. And my thought, I had to stop myself and say, no, now's the time to talk to Ruth. Now's the time to talk to Tim Snyder. Now's the time to talk, as George Conway said this morning, to the historians. We are out of the land of rule of law. We are in the land of something else just happened, and lawyering this doesn't quite, I think, convey the enormity of what has shifted. And the other thing that I want to say, well, thank you. That was Norm Ornstein, wasn't it? Okay, so the other thing I want to say, and this is really important, is that I think we, and I think Attorney General Allison made this point, but I want to say it really explicitly and expressly. There was a temptation in 2016 to say the courts checked it. The courts checked the worst forms of authoritarianism, the Administrative Procedures Act, the Trump kept losing in court. these are not the same courts anymore. And we have to be very, very clear that this last term at the US Supreme Court was a natural experiment in what is going to happen in terms of checking the things that we want to see checked. And I think that the court failed spectacularly at that natural experiment. And so what I want to just suggest to you is that the kind of way that we looked at the 2020 election through the prism of this is fundamentally an institutionalist court. We have at least 5, 6 institutionalists on the court. They care about democracy. You know, January 6th happened across the street. They care about public approval. That court is nowhere in evidence as of last month, and I think we have to really reckon with that. The other thing that I just want to say is that we saw from the court in 2 different layers a sea change. One, doctrinal, right? We can talk about Fisher, we can talk about the immunity decision, we can talk about Anderson, the Colorado decision, and these were not 3-3-3 decisions. These were big swing decisions, right down ideological lines with some defections that are interesting by Justice Barrett, but anyone who tells you this is a 3-3-3 court and that there is a moderate 3 that's going to show up for protecting democracy, I want what they're smoking. I mean, I really want it. And the other thing I want to say, and this is important, and these 2 things don't get connected all the time, is there's another layer of this cake, which is the judicial misconduct that gets covered as though it's some orthogonal question that has nothing to do with the doctrine. It is the doctrine. It is the plan, and it is the plan kind of coming to fruition. And so when you have flagrant violations of ethics rules, refusals to abide by statutory, requirements that you recuse and that you disclose, and what you hear from the court is, we heard this earlier this morning, not only are we the imperial court, but we are going to confer imperial powers upon the executive branch. Those are behaviors that need to be looked at separate and apart from doctrine. The other thing I want to say is, and I will just end here, but I think it's important, we are making a category error when we talk about Project 2025 as something that will happen if Trump gets elected. Because the US Supreme Court has methodically ensured that it is already happening now. So to suggest that we are going to cut it off by voting is to fundamentally ignore that it is happening in front of us. And if you look at the sort of 3 buckets of Project 2025 and what the plan is, they have already been reinstantiated by the US Supreme Court this term alone. So as Jen just said, concentrating power in the presidency and the executive branch, that's already happened. That is the substance of the immunity decision, and that is without a question a sea change in how we think about executive power. If you think about achieving these sort of long-standing conservative principles of deregulation, right, rethinking about government agencies, thinking about the power of the entire regulatory state as we see it, that's done. That's done in Chevron, but it was also done in the bump stock case, it was done in the EPA case, it's done with the major questions doctrine, so it's over. That's happened, whether or not Project 2025 happens. And then this religious right agenda that both Bob and Jen referenced, also done. It's happened. The court has been eroding the wall between church and state, privileging certain religions and diminishing the rights of others. That's been going on for a long time. So I just want to be very, very clear, and I don't sit here in a voice of gloom. I too am loving the sort of starburst sugar shock feeling that I felt all weekend. But I think we have to be very, very clear that with or without a Trump presidency, we have an immense amount of work to do on the courts because this is happening all around us. And here's where I'll end, and this is actually something that I think I need to say on a panel of journalists. It is malpractice the way my profession has failed to meet the moment. It is without a doubt, and I say this as a Supreme Court reporter who has so much respect for the Supreme Court press corps, we have so utterly failed to explain both what the Supreme Court did this last term And the absolute stakes for democracy itself of this election, and the corporate media, respectfully, has not done a good job on really, really connecting up that which has already happened in plain sight that we have allowed to happen, and the peril that awaits us. Thank you.
Thanks, Dahlia. Yeah, go ahead. The panelists, you shouldn't hold back. You can,
Yes.
you can weigh in.
No,
I
everything.
am going to ask Bob a foreign policy question, and then we're going to come out to the audience to stump the experts. So get your hard questions ready, audience.
Everything she said, but I would say this. If Kamala Harris does one thing in this campaign, she must put substantial court reform on the top of the agenda. It has happened, but that need not be our future. We have 9 seats on the Supreme Court. There is no magic to 9. At other times, including when they were excluding Merrick Garland from the court, we had a court of 8. We have 13 circuits. We could have 13 judges. Secondly, there are legal ways to have term limits, and of course we have to have mandatory ethics reform. And if Democrats, by some stroke of luck, guile, political excellence, are able to take the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they do not fix the courts because they are beholden to the filibuster, they should hang their heads in shame.
Bob.
Norm has lost control of the panel once again.
I lost control of this panel when we did our planning call. I told them the topic. They're like, no, Norm, we're not doing that. They told me what they, it's
True fact.
not kidding. I had not thought about this conference as an act of faith and optimism before this panel, but it is true that when we had the planning call, I was in London, and it was the middle of the night, my time, and I was walking around getting my 10,000 steps in. You know, it was dire. I do not think we should confuse ourselves that the battle for democracy is going to be easy or a slam dunk, or that the country is going to suddenly come to its senses. The country or the press, frankly, unlike the brisk candor of my colleagues who are on this dais with me, there still is a lot of resistance to facing the reality. I mean, how many times do we have to be told what the project is about before we believe Donald Trump, Project 2024, the speakers at the RNC, and the others who are articulating this dystopian vision that is so contrary to America. That vision does not stop at our borders. It is also an America First vision, another term that has deep historical resonance. So Bob and I do work both in both the domestic and the international realms. So Bob, would you just give us, we shouldn't give it short shrift, but just give us a word more about the foreign policy picture, and then we'll open it up for questions, and Dahlia or Jen should feel free to weigh in as we look beyond our borders.
Well, sure, and you know, foreign policy is an area where we, as a country, have disagreed from the beginning. I mean, Jefferson and Hamilton beat each other to death practically over foreign policy issues having to do with the French Revolution and the alliance with Britain. So I don't, you know, there is not a this is what our foreign policy should be answer. But I do think we can make a few observations, and one of those observations, I do think we could get agreement in this room that America's alliances have been the bedrock, in a way, of our foreign policy, and have really been the thing holding this world together to some extent. It is not just the United States. It is the democracies of Asia and the democracies of Europe that have created a world which has made it very difficult for authoritarians to maneuver. And unfortunately, I think that's been eroding a little bit. But one thing we can be clear on, both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and the people that they speak for are not just not interested in our allies, they are actively hostile to our allies, because they see the world as divided between liberalism, and I think they would have to admit that they mean by that even classical liberalism of the founders' variety on the one hand, and anti-liberalism and this kind of ethno-religious definition on the other. And as they look out at the world, therefore, they look at the European democracies and they're rooting for the Le Pen forces in France. They're rooting for the AfD in Germany. They're rooting for Farage, not just the Tory party in Britain. And that would be a seismic shift in the direction of American foreign policy, Republican and Democrat, going back to World War II. And it happens to be the case that in their hostility to liberalism, they clearly embrace authoritarians around the world. Obviously, they can't stop talking about Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban is a joke in Europe, but in American Trump circles, he's their hero, he's their idol. And they do like Vladimir Putin. Christopher Caldwell in the New York Times has repeatedly praised Vladimir Putin. Tucker Carlson, I didn't have to get into, and Vladimir Putin. And so, that is, whatever you think about what our policy should be in one place or another, the fact that Trump clearly has an affinity, and his movement has an affinity for dictators like Putin and Orban and the genius and wonderful love letters with Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. I mean, this is a real pattern. And basically, he talks, his supporters like to think of him as tough, but he's tough in the way a bully is tough. He's tough against people who he thinks either won't or can't do anything in response to what he does, like our allies. But when he comes to facing the really tough people on the world stage, like Putin, like Xi Jinping, like Kim Jong-un, his response is, let's make a deal. We'll figure it out. And so his whole approach, which is, by the way, diametrically opposed to the person that I worked for in government, which was Ronald Reagan, whose affection for allies was one of his most famous attributes in foreign policy. And so the notion that they could even talk about Reagan in the same breath with Trump is absurd. But I really think that this is a recipe for unwinding everything that's been accomplished in the world since World War II and taking us back precisely to the period before World War II, which, by the way, Russell Vought says he would like to do. He explicitly wants to bring us back to the 1920s, domestically as well as internationally.
It's the opposite of Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall. It's Mr. Putin, put up this wall again with Ukraine on the other side of it. We're going to come to the audience now for questions. The hands are flying. Clearly, there was plenty of caffeine in your lunch beverages. And who has the microphones? Don't make me come down off the stage with the mics. By the way, I'm not as nice as the other moderators. I insist that questions be questions. The mic will be taken away from you. I somewhat allow run-on sentences to a point, but a question, please, questioners. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask about what I think was said about civil servants swearing an oath directly to Donald Trump. Was this meant literally? Do they actually raise their right hands or plan to raise their right hands and swear an oath to Donald Trump? Because I don't want to make glib comparisons between Trump and Hitler. That is glib. but that's precisely what Hitler did when he took power. So did you mean that literally? They actually are raising their hands
Oh,
now
yes.
today and
Oh, yes.
swearing an oath to Donald Trump?
And they have set up a training camp. It's to prepare these people to sift through and sift out any normal people and to put in people who would be slavishly loyal already to Donald Trump. And specifically with regard to the FBI and the DOJ, they have talked about a, quote, major revision, meaning this whole idea about the weaponization of the Justice Department. Are they for it or against it? I think they're for it because that's what they're talking about. In a world in which President Biden allowed his son to be indicted and convicted, Bob Menendez to be indicted and convicted, the Democrats are either the most incompetent weaponizers of power one has ever seen, or this is projection, like big time. And this is the mindset that they have in place.
It reminds me of that movie, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. They're the weaponizers that couldn't shoot straight. What is the oath? Where are you getting that? Where does that come from? What is it?
That is part of the 2025, and Trump and his cronies have said it as well.
That you will actually say, I
Swear
swear
allegiance to Trump personally, correct?
to Trump personally.
Is it-
That's amazing. Okay, we're gonna toggle between the sides of the room, so let's come over to this side of the room, please. Okay, and we're gonna give preference to those who haven't asked already, as best as I can.
Oh, okay. I want to ask about democracy reform. We've talked a lot, both during your panel and today, about some of the failing guardrails that have led us to this crisis right now of autocracy. And let's say that Trump is defeated in the 2024 election. What do you think should be are the most important priorities in terms of democracy reform for the next 2 to 4 years? And what do you think are the biggest priorities longer term for our democracy in terms of reform?
Okay, Dahlia, will you
I
do
can,
the
I can
honors?
start, and I think I'm going to start by saying everything. I think that if you sort of sit with the reality that a president who lost the popular election has appointed 5 of the 6 sitting Supreme Court justices who were then voted on by a Senate that is not reflected by majority rule, right? So we have a majority president appointing Supreme Court, lifetime tenured Supreme Court justices who can't be removed, who are then voted on by a majority Senate, and then they sit for life, right? So that's 3 levels of minority rule, and that is to construct a Supreme Court that says that its job is to protect minorities. So I just want to say the system is working perfectly. If you think about it, right? And then add in, what Jen says about the filibuster, add in the Electoral College. So I think what I want to say is, and this has been a theme throughout the day, we are seeing wildly unpopular ideas time and time again, right? When you see the polling on what people want on guns, it is not reflected in what we're seeing either in 2025 or at the Supreme Court. What people want in terms of constricting the vote, right, is not, in fact, manifest. It's in 2025. The Supreme Court is certainly, right, as they do away with the Voting Rights Act, not reflecting popular will. So you are seeing a sort of slow-rolling minority rule machine working perfectly. And so every one of those things, whether that means Electoral College reform, whether it means filibuster reform, whether it means reforming the Senate, adding states, adding 4 more seats to the Supreme Court so that it's congruent with the number of circuits. And I think that I just want to say, because someone said earlier today, and it's true, this kind of democracy reform language is where people just go on screen save. I mean, I'm looking, even you all are going on screen save. And this is the kind of stuff that you are never going to energize voters. Get out there and do, Senate reform, right? Get out there and do filibuster reform. But if we don't do those system-wide democracy reforms, we're going to continue to live in a minority rule world. And the last thing I want to say, because I think Norm gave us very, very strict instructions to be hopeful, is I just want to point out that every single state that has put abortion on the ballot by way of initiative or referendum, every single state, not just Ruby Red, Kentucky, and Kansas, but I just want to say every one of those states, the effort to do that ran into the brick wall of system failures, right? Whether it was a state Supreme Court, whether it was, oh, we don't like the spacing, right, that you've used in your ballot question. We don't like the wording they told us that and every one of those prevailed nonetheless. And so I just want to say, even though it feels as though we're walking against this juggernaut of structural democracy failures that keeps shutting down efforts for, the popular will to prevail, the popular will, at least in every one of those states, has prevailed, and prevailed resoundingly. So we can do this despite, I think, structural failures, but we absolutely, if we don't address every single one of those kind of elements of the machinery of democracy, that by design, right, this is all by design, made sure that democracies did not, in fact, actually operate as democracies. If we don't roll those all back, we are, in fact, going to see this, trajectory continue. So I just want to say, take heart, have courage, because in every state where they tried to shut it down by judicial fiat or by, some state AG or SG that was like, no, you can't do that, they lost. Because you have to be aware of the ways in which these invisible systems, right, of minority rule exist at every single level, not just the national, but the state level, and then you just have to power through.
And by the way, there are very concrete, very specific, frankly, easily done things if you win elections. Now, there are some big things. We do not have a constitutional right to vote in this country, believe it or not. We have amendments that say you can't prevent people voting for certain reasons, but we don't have an affirmative right to vote. That needs to be changed. We can do gerrymandering by an independent commission. We can make Election Day a national holiday. We can decorrupt the executive branch by putting teeth on the Emoluments Clause, by making the Hatch Act enforceable by criminal penalties. There are lots of things to do, but the first predicate is to get back in power and then to use it. One party has been brazen in using power. Can you imagine denying the president a right to a hearing on his Supreme Court nominee for 8 months? How did they do it? Because they had the votes. They simply did it. And unless you have an equally combative, aggressive force propounding democracy, you will lose.
Bob, we heard a note of hope. We're going to come back out for another round of questions, but we heard a note of short-term hope, I think, from Dahlia with the success of the choice referenda, more of a medium term from Jen. What gives you hope in the long term, given the threats that we're facing? This was the original topic of the panel, by the way, that caused a mutiny, but you see how stubborn I am.
Well, the mutiny was because we didn't want to have a whole conversation about how we're going to deal with the coming autocracy. I mean, I would like to spend the next 3 months preventing the autocracy from coming. And so I really think that needs to be the focus. And I mean, I don't even know, I'm probably not going to answer Norm's question, but...
At least he's honest about it.
But I do think Sarah Longwell put it best. This Republican Party is the product of a national sorting that has occurred over decades. And basically, when Southern, white nationalist types left the Democratic Party and made their way to Wallace and then made their way into the Republican Party, there became this just incredible shift. I don't think this Republican Party represents a majority in this country, but the only way to make that be not true is to beat them again and again and again so that they cease to be a viable party. I don't think the Republican Party in the long run in this form is a viable party. So that's my optimistic note. If we can get through this election, this is their best shot. And it may be their last shot, because after all, we are not a white majority country anymore, and we are certainly not a white male majority country anymore, and so running as a white male party is not going to continue to win. They managed to get away with it this time by allowing this sociopath to seize control of the party. The heartbreak about all this is how many of my Republican friends are willing to support this, but I don't think they will support it again and again if we defeat it. And so there is just nothing more important than winning this election this year and then continuing to win. I think this Republican Party will split into component parts, or there will be a whole new party or whatever, but this Republican Party cannot last electorally in this country.
I think that does answer my question on the long term. Just to close this second round of questions out, 2018, 2020, 2022 were all referenda in one form or another on Trumpism, and it was resoundingly rejected against the tides of expectation in all three of those cycles. And those, as other panelists have said, and as we talked about in our press conference this morning, the fundamentals are that if this election is a referendum on, do we want democracy and freedom or autocracy and dictatorship in our country? That is a very different election than quibbling about how much your gas costs and border policy and the like. Okay, back out to the audience for one more round. Looking at the time, I'm going to cluster these questions together. If you have asked a question, I'm going to ask you not to ask a question in this round. Otherwise, let's do, again, one from this side of the room and one from this side of the room. Questions only, please. We're going to take two together, not as much as we value your thoughts, speeches.
So if there's a 50-50 chance that the patient will die or survive, it's tempting to want to just think about the positive side, we're going to win the election and so on, but what do we do to prepare for the 50% chance the patient will die?
You know, that's an important enough question that I am going to start us. I'm not going to split it. What do we do to, let's imagine that world in which, because it is eminently possible, let's imagine that world. This is the thing that triggered the mutiny on our prep call. What do we do? What does January 20th, and we'll have a whole panel dedicated to specific remedies on going on offense against autocracy, with Judge Nancy Gertner, Danya Perry, and AG Matt Plotkin to close our day out. But what do we do, guys, if that transpires?
First of all, if you haven't already read it, reread it and read it for your family and get a whole stack of them because it's a really tiny book, and that is Tim Snyder's book on tyranny. It describes the behaviors that you must adopt when you're resisting autocracy, tyranny. They are, don't give permission in advance. It means to love your neighbor and get out of your cycle of doom scrolling. It means to make alliances. There are 20 of them. The whole book is like 125 pages. You can read it, in one sitting. It is absolutely essential. Those are individual actions or individual actions directing you to others. And the other is you organize. You become a citizen, an active citizen. I wrote a book on this. Dahlia wrote a book on this, which I think she's going to talk about more, and that is Women in 2018 after they got over the trauma of Donald Trump's election organized. They organized like crazy. They didn't have a model. People who had never run for office ran for office. People who had never formed a group suddenly set up networks. Those networks, those organizations, whether it's Indivisible, which is arguably 1 million people, or whether it's the liberal voters of Chesterfield County, which is about 2,000 or 3,000, those organizations and networks remained in place. And you have to reactivate and regenerate and revitalize those to engage in all sorts of citizenship activities, whether it's peaceful protest, whether it's running for elections, what have you. And so individual action and then group action.
Dahlia, then Bob.
No, I just think one of the themes that I've heard resoundingly today is that we're in a foot race between autocracy and normalization, right? And that in a deep, deep way, we have, all of us, I think, tolerated things that would have shocked us in 2016 and 2018 and 2019. And the fact that good, decent people are like, maybe family separation wasn't that bad. You know, maybe the Muslim ban wasn't that bad. I think all comes down to, you know, what we heard on earlier panels as like, maybe that stuff didn't happen to me. And so I think that the really big challenge right now is to say, like, the thing about being a frog in the pot, you know, we can normalize anything, but we're all going down together. And I think one of the lessons that I take from Tim Snyder and so many other people is that the myth that this is the best perfected democracy is now a myth, right? There are a lot of people who have been, you know, as Maya Wiley said, fighting every single day, and now we're all together in that. And I think that that paring away of the illusion that some of us are just lucky and some of us are not is the thing that is now really in question. So we work together. And, you know, as Jen said, most of the people in this room were actually carved out of democracy. As the, you know, framers thought about democracy, most of us couldn't vote. and you know, many of us had no power. And we have managed to not perfect democracy, but make it better. Thank you, Reconstruction amendments. That's the work, is to keep working on perfecting democracy and understand that just because you or your family may be fine doesn't mean the democracy's fine.
Bob, we're going to give you the last word.
Oh, well, good. Well, I don't want to be the only person on this panel not promoting a book, so if you want to read about how this movement has been part of American history going back to the founding, I have a very nice short book called Rebellion, which I recommend to you. So having said that, you know, I think the thing we need to be ready for and ready to respond to is not some just like complete totalitarian repression. It's going to be little, they're not going to be little, but they're going to be things that don't affect anybody in this room directly. For instance, the deportation. I think that is almost certain to be something that they're going to try. I think that's going to be a high priority. And one of the reasons is because they think most Americans feel the way they do about, I personally don't, but the way they do about immigration. And the Democratic Party is acting that way, by the way. And so that is the moment, because the methods that they're going to use to carry out this deportation are inherently un-American and anti-democratic and anti-liberal. We need to get ready to do a lot of yelling and pressuring about things that are not necessarily touching us. When some former American official is all of a sudden being investigated for spying for the Chinese, we need to know that that's not what's really going on and raise a fuss, even if we didn't like the way they conducted themselves in office. There's going to be these things. The big danger is they will isolate on particular targets who don't touch the vast majority of Americans, and so the vast majority of Americans are going to continue to be asleep. It's our job to make sure everybody is awake from day one to all of these tactics that they're going to be carrying out.
I want to thank my panelists for a truly stimulating conversation. And it's such a more hopeful panel than when we prepared it.
It was a good thing we did.